In this session, we're going to look at the topics of flexible labour and post-industrialism. Flexible labour and post-industrialism are a stage that come after what is being called Fordism or industrialism. Fordism was a mode of labour control dating back to the 1900s, and it comes from the Ford labour factories. Fordism refers to a structure of labour where the worker sold their labour for 8 hours a day. Post-Fordism, or a mode of accumulation that David Harvey has called flexible accumulation, is characterized by flexibility with respect to labour markets, products, and patterns of consumption. Let's look at this question in more detail by examining an actual car factory. The height of the industrial era in Western nations was from about the 1930s to the 1980s. If we take an example of the car industry, say General Motors, this can give us an example of what we mean by Fordism. So in a factory that produced cars, we had raw material, we had what Marx called labor power, which is the auto worker, and we had the means of production, which are the machines. And all of those go together to produce an object, which in the case of the car factory is cars. So in this kind of factory, in an industrial era, the object or the car belongs to the owner of the factory because all of the inputs, the raw material, the labor power, the means of production, all of these belong to the capitalist. The worker does an 8-hour shift, they sell their labor power, and they earn a wage, say about $500 a week. Now, Marx predicted that from this industrial model, workers would reclaim private property from the owner, and they would reclaim the object, the cars, as well as their own labor power. But instead of workers reclaiming private property, as Marx predicted, what we saw instead was the major restructuring of international capital following the energy crisis of the 1970s, shrinking local markets for cars, a sales slump and recession experienced by most car producers. To counter this decline, auto producers sought to penetrate foreign markets, set up a global assembly line as the manufacture of cars assembled from components produced in different countries, and to expand production in the third world. So General Motors opened factories in Latin America and other places where they could pay their workers less. So what happens to the auto workers in Detroit and Michigan who lose their jobs? Daniel Bell argues that they enter service work, Amway, Taco Bell. Factory work is no longer the norm, and industry is no longer what drives the economy. Profits are now made through the finance sector rather than the production of goods and services. Due to the changes to the labor market, employers have taken advantage of weakened unions and surplus labor due to unemployment to push for more flexible work regimes. David Harvey has referred to this as a differentiation between, on the one hand, the core, or the small minority who enjoy job security, benefits, and salary, versus the periphery, or the part-timers, casuals, the fixed-term contract workers with little job security who now make up large sectors of the economy. In his book on taxi workers in New York, Bijou Matthews disagrees with the term post-industrial, saying that it's not that there is no longer any industry, it's just that industry has been restructured to benefit the most powerful and wealthy, and it has shifted to the third world. He gives the example of the taxi industry as a service industry. So the structure of the taxi industry consists of the labor power, which is that of the taxi driver, the means of production, which is both the car, and the medallion, which is a license or permit that was privatized and seen as a form of very lucrative private property that value is up to as much as $1 million or more per medallion. And the service is that of transport. So let's look at how the taxi industry was structured over two different periods as described by Bijou Matthews in his book. The first period is the commission system from about 1937 to 1985, where the means of production were owned by fleet companies. Workers were employed and they got to keep 49% of the meter. They were also paid benefits. So much like the factory worker in the Fordist era, the taxi driver was also seen as a paid wage laborer. The leasing period, which is from 1985 to the present, is one where the means of production, the car and the medallion, are owned by fleet companies and then leased to drivers. The drivers became independent contractors according to the fleet companies. Workers pay a fixed weekly or daily rate to the company, and then they get to keep the rest. They don't get any benefits, unlike in the commission system. So let's assume that, say, a taxi driver pays $100 a night for the lease and about $20 a night for gas. So they invest about $120 in their costs before they take the car out for the night. Now let's think, what is the take-home pay in each of these systems if the driver earns $120 in a night shift? Under the commission system, they would earn about $60. Under the leasing system, because they've paid $100 for the lease and $20 for gas, they would earn $0. This mode of organization that the taxi industry comes under in the leasing era is part of a broader system known as neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a mode of economic organization based on privatization and deregulation of the economy. It depends on outsourcing, subcontracting, and offloading risk. For instance, all of the risk under the leasing system is offloaded onto the driver. If it's a slow night, the garage or the fleet owner still makes the same amount of money, but the driver is the one who must take the loss. And we can also see that how this applies in the case of the Nike shoes. We talked about the ways that production is globalized and it is separated into those who produce in various different parts and places, the parts of the shoe versus those who do the marketing. And likewise with reality TV and the ways in which that is franchised and also outsourced from paid full-time actors to usually lower paid non-actors. And finally, the mode of flexible labor that the leasing system is based on, we can see at play in many other areas of the economy. For instance, in the hair salon, hairdressers used to be employed by the owners of the salon as workers paid a regular wage, cut people's hair. Now, one of the moves has been towards leasing out seats, and so the hairdresser must have their own tools. They pay a weekly cost to lease out the seat, which means that the owner of the salon has a fixed income, but the actual worker only makes an income after they have made enough money out of customers to pay off their lease. So what is the difference between Marx's factory worker in an industrial society and the quote-unquote independent contractor in a neoliberal era? Well, the independent contractor, or the driver, has the illusion of owning his or her own labor power. There is more risk assumed by the worker. The company is assured an income under the neoliberal system, but the independent contractor is not. And this is where Matthew describes how after 9/11, when drivers suffered a big loss of income in the city, the fleet companies were relatively well shielded. And finally, the worker in the factory has a typically 8-hour working day. They take home a fixed pay, whereas after an 8-hour working day, the independent contractor may take home nothing or even owe money.